Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. This week's podcast is all about ladybugs, or lady beetles as they are commonly known, and why you should never purchase them online or in a garden center. One other thing to mention, if you find this podcast as fascinating as I did, you should check out the Lost Ladybug project at lostladybug.org. You can find and photograph local ladybugs and send them to entomologists at Cornell for identification and data logging. It seems like a fun project to do with science-minded kids, or something I plan on doing myself the next time I see an interesting one in the wild. My guest this week is J.P. Michaud. Dr. Michaud is a professor of entomology at Kansas State University. He is an insect ecologist specializing in biological control and other aspects of crop protection entomology. He has a background in evolutionary ecology, and many of his research endeavors are guided by the implications of evolutionary theory. His interests include cultural and conservational approaches to biological control of aphids in field crops, ecology of the Coccinellidae, which is the proper word for lady beetles, I learned, and the interface between host plant resistance and biological control. Dr. Michaud completed his Bachelor of Science at McGill University and his Master's and Ph.D. at Simon Fraser University. Hey, JP, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Ted.
Yeah, I got to hear you speak down at the biocontrols meeting last month in Portland. You were the keynote speaker. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. And one of the things that you talked about was why people should not be buying ladybugs, or lady beetles, as they're called. Can we talk a little bit about what ladybugs are? Talk a little about their life cycle before we dive into these reasons why they're not a good idea to purchase?
Sure. And to be clear, I'm referring to one particular species of lady beetles that's harvested from the wild. But in terms of life cycles, they're all pretty similar. So life cycle, depending on temperature, will take about 25 to 30 days, so about a month. So they have a full metamorphosis, so egg, larval, pupal stages followed by the adult. And so both the larval stage and the adult stage feed on aphids and other small soft-bodied insects and the eggs of other insects. So the larval stage is going to last anywhere from, I would say, 14 to 20 days. And that's the period where they're consuming aphids. And of course, the bigger they get, the more they consume. Now, the adults can live quite a variable period of time. They also feed on aphids, but the females eat a lot more aphids than the males, especially when they're producing eggs. But come fall and shorter days, cooler temperatures, different lady beetles have different strategies for surviving the winter. And most of them in North America go into some kind of diapause. And they hibernate, just like other animals do in winter. So they become dormant and very quiescent, and then and they remain that way until spring. So in the fall generation, they can live as long as 6 to 8 months. But once they start reproducing in the spring, then they start dying very quickly. But then you have another generation. So, for example, here in where I am in central North America, the number of generations per year will vary from anywhere from 2 to 5, depending on the availability of aphids. Now, out here in the high plains, it's harder for them to survive the summer than it is the winter when it's hot and dry because there's no aphids. So they actually go into a different type of diapause we call estivation. So they're still active, they're out and about, trying to glean a bit of food, stay hydrated, but they're not reproducing. And they do that, when they stop reproducing, they can live 2 or 3 months even in the summer. But again, once they find a good patch of aphids, they start to produce eggs. The females will again start dying very quickly. So there's the trade-off to diapause. When you do reproduce, you reproduce less, but it's better than reproducing when there's no food around.
That's really interesting. I know that I've seen different types of ladybugs in my area up here in Seattle. Some that look more like what I would see available in, like you said, when you go to a store or a garden center, a lot of times you'll see them there in the little bags moving around. How many different species of ladybugs are there approximately in a given area? And is there an easy way tell them apart?
Well, they are, because lady beetles are what we call aposematic, so most of them produce a kind of bad-tasting alkaloid in their blood, which makes them very distasteful for birds. So they're brightly colored to advertise that. And so because of that, they have very, very distinctive coloration patterns. So they're not, as far as insects go, they're pretty easy to tell apart, but there's hundreds of species, and you still really have to know. The common species around are very abundant, and everybody will recognize those, but there's a lot of rare species that are probably in areas where you don't see them as often, and some of them are extremely small, as small as 2 millimeters across, so most people are unaware. Some of those eat just mites. So there's a lot of different species, but the ones that most people are going to be familiar with, there's probably 3 to 5 very common species that occur all across North America. And one of those, of course, is the one you're seeing that people sell in these bags or containers. It's called the convergent lady beetle, Hippodamia convergens. And this is the one that is sold by mail order all over the country and probably should not be allowed by law. Unfortunately, because the beetle itself is widely distributed as a species, there is no regulatory control of this. And so what people are doing now, the interesting thing about Hippodamia, in a mountainous area like in the Sierra Nevadas of California, in the fall they form aggregations to go into this hibernation state. So people actually go up there and they find these sites and they can shovel them into buckets. That's how many there are. And so they're collecting these beetles for free. And so this has really put all the people who used to rear and sell lady beetles out of business, because it doesn't cost anything to shovel them into buckets, but it costs a lot to rear them in a laboratory. And yet these beetles should not be shipped because, first of all, let's get to efficacy. These are the old beetles that have survived the winter. So the females have very little eggs left in them, and they're held in cold storage. So once you bring them out of cold storage, their automatic response is to fly away, because they're way up in the mountains and they have to come down the valley in a natural situation to find something to eat in the fields. So they don't tend to stay where, people release all these beetles in their garden, they come back the next day, there's nothing there. Now, if you have a greenhouse, you can contain some of that too, but what you really want, ideally, in releasing adults, you want them to lay some eggs, because it's those larvae that are going to be diligent about combing every plant and getting every last aphid. And again, these older beetles, they hardly have any eggs left in them. They're like little old ladies with canes at that point. And so they're really not very effective. But there's bigger and more concerning ecological issues, which is the fact that they have their own little ecosystem associated with them. So they have parasites, they have diseases, and those diseases and the whole suite of organisms associated with those beetles in California is not going to be the same as that occurring in other parts of the country. So when we're moving these things around and mailing them across the country, we're also redistributing their diseases and their natural enemies to other beneficial populations, which may not have the same level of resistance or coadaptation to these diseases and parasites. Okay, that's one thing. Another thing is they have very different behaviors. Even the same species, different populations have very different behaviors here, for example, in the high plains than they do on the coast or where you are up in Seattle. Completely different climate, weather system, even different patterns of prey utilization, what they can survive on and what they can't. Dramatic differences between populations. And so when you move these beetles around and they leave and they get out, they go and they interbreed with the local populations. And so what we have a term for that we call as genetic admixture. So they don't have the genetics that's appropriate for that region. So they're actually, whatever traits they're conferring when they interbreed with local populations are not going to be suited to those areas. So it's just another way we're weakening local populations of these beetles by, distributing them all over the country to habitats and environments they don't come from.
Yeah, I want to kind of highlight that point because I think that's really crucial what you're saying there. So this idea that even though you may find the same species in another part of the country from where they're originally harvested, their behavior is going to be different. Their disease resistance is going to be different. So we could actually, assuming, let's just say in theory, we had a greenhouse and we had a few native lady beetles already in there. If we bring in, if we order online and bring in these other wild harvested ones, we could be, in theory, really damaging those lady beetles' ability to protect our plants in that greenhouse. Is that essentially what you're getting at?
Yeah, on a much larger scale, because it's not going to affect anything in the greenhouse, but it has the potential for negative impacts on your local populations of the same species, because they will have completely different biology. I can tell you this. I've gone and seen the Hippodamia convergences in Puerto Rico. Well, it's lost its ability to diapause, but guess what? It can feed on some tropical aphids that you could put would not even support the development and survival of our populations. And so it acquired over the years completely different set of adaptations and to survive where it is. And yeah, you could still bring them here and interbreed them with our beetles, but then you'd have a mishmash of traits that in the hybrid progeny that really wouldn't work well in either setting.
Wow.
So the difference between these different populations is remarkable. That's something that I've been studying for over 20 years. I mean, we've done comparisons in our lab of Hippodamia from Georgia, from California, and from right here in Kansas. And I'll tell you, for example, insecticide resistance. The ones from Georgia, you can spray them all day long with pyrethroids and organophosphate insecticides, and they don't even die. I mean, we basically reached the solubility limit of the insecticides, and we couldn't kill them. And over here, they'll just die at the drop of a hat. And the reason for that is because in Georgia they have a lot of cotton production, and it's very chemically dependent. So all the Hippodamia in Georgia have this ridiculously high level of insecticide resistance that you don't see in other populations. So that's something that we just did, as a result of our agricultural practices. So imagine what nature has done in terms of making them different.
That's amazing. I had no idea. And the insecticide thing is really interesting because that's sort of what we see with a lot of our pests, and why biocontrols are so important is because we create these pesticidal resistances from spraying all these pesticides and insecticides, consistently over time on a given population. That's fascinating.
Oh yeah, and you can go down to Brazil and you've got completely different species of Coccinellidae that are abundant in cotton production there. And guess what? They're all resistant to pesticides too now because they had to be.
The Coccinellidae, that's the Dinocampus. Is that that you're talking about there? Or is
I'm
that
sorry.
Something else?
Let me clarify. I'm sorry for that. Coccinellida is the generic term for lady beetle. That's the family Coccinellidae. So it's just the prop. Yeah, the Coccinellida is just a lady beetle
So what's the Dinocampus Coccinella?
Dinocampus Coccinelli used to be called a different name. It's a hymenopterous parasitoid in the family Braconidae. So that's the family that has a lot of different parasitoids, including the little aphid parasitoids. They're all in that family. These are much bigger than the aphid parasitoids. And the interesting thing is they are all female, so they don't produce males. And see, there's a big advantage to that, of course, because when they emerge from their host in the spring, they don't have to look for a mate. They can just go out and start stinging beetles. They attack the adult beetles, and then the larvae develops inside and crawls out of the adult beetle. And it's very interesting because it's turning out to be a very complex relationship. And the parasitoid doesn't just inject an egg and some, it also injects some viruses which modify the behavior of the beetle. And so what actually happens is once the mature larvae exits through the anus of the host, it spins a cocoon because it's a little wasp larvae, but the adult beetle that's still alive clings to it and protects it and stays alive for quite a few days. And they've actually shown in the field that if you remove the old parasitized beetle from the cocoon of the parasitoid, its survival is greatly reduced. So the parasitoid needs the beetle to sort of hug onto it until it finishes its development. It leaves behind this virus in the beetle even after it's controlling the behavior of its host even after it's physically left it.
Wow. That sounds a little like Bavaria.
Yes, and again, fungi do the same thing. They'll alter the behavior of their host before they kill it, so that they end up in a suitable environment for their dispersal.
But this is an internal parasite, though, that's found inside of harvested lady beetles that will come back and kill your lady beetle or ladybird.
Well, this is the thing. Those harvested lady beetles are the parasitoids are diapause inside the beetle, so they're hibernating inside their hosts. They're waiting for spring, just like the beetles are. So their kind of metabolism is all on hold. They're trying to just slow down everything and just stay alive until it's springtime. And of course, when you harvest the beetles there and mail them all over the country, they're mailing the parasitoids. And we've done it. We've bought bags of beetles, and you can see between 5 and 15% of those beetles are parasitized. And it's not just parasites. They have different spiroplasmas and different types of little parasitic bacterial infections and things. Chronic infections, just like you can have a chronic a sexually transmitted disease is not going to kill you, but over the time it really, it can really affect your fitness and your health. So these beetles have their little sexually transmitted diseases, literally, and also mites that live on their surface and suck their juices and all these kind of things. So, but of course, within a localized population that's isolated from others, like on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, all of that ecology adapts to what's around it. And so the mites and the parasites, they over time attenuate their impact, because if they kill too many hosts, they kill them too quickly, then they don't have any hosts, right? So there's complex truces sort of between all these different organisms. But then when you take them and you throw them into a completely different population and they're interbreeding and they're sharing all this ecology, well, those populations where you've sent them may not, or very likely do not have the same levels of resistance to those parasites or diseases. And so this is the ecological concern there, that this is one of the most important species of lady beetle we have for controlling aphids, certainly here in Kansas, but in many, many agricultural settings worldwide, continent-wide. And by moving this population, everything from this one population in and spreading it all over the country, we're actually, doing more harm than good to one of our most important species nationwide.
So if people want to utilize ladybugs or lady beetles in their garden, or naturally attract these ladybugs, what do you recommend for people that want to promote ladybug health in their area?
Same thing for attracting parasitoids. It's the natural attraction. If you have a healthy little ecosystem in your garden or wherever, that will come by themselves. Now, granted, some areas, there's a landscape effect. So there's some areas where they don't have good reservoirs of lady beetles to attract them from. If you're a very, very, but even, I shouldn't say, there's some species, a few species that thrive even in cities where you have just one little abandoned lot. You'll have some weeds with some aphids on, you'll find certain species that will be there. Now, it won't be the same diversity you'll find out in a wildlife reserve, but mostly, if people live in an urban habitat where there's a patchwork of gardens and some floral resources, you should have a good reservoirs of natural enemies. They should come by themselves. And what does it take? It takes flowering plants. Okay? So if you look at all your different beneficial insects that we want, whether it's parasites, whether it's predators like lacewings or lady beetles, at some point in their life cycle, they need floral resources. And for the adult beetles out here, it's during the summer in the adult stage, because sometimes the only source of moisture they can get is from a flower in the form of nectar, or extrafloral nectar in some cases. So the flowers act as an actual well, or as a source of moisture in very dry situations. And so, but the pollen is also important, because the pollen is a source of protein. And so it can actually help them as a source of protein. Now, almost all lady beetles will feed on pollen and nectar. Very few of them, but some of them can actually complete their whole life cycle on just pollen. There's only one species that we know of, but it's a very important one, and that's the 12-spotted lady beetle, the pink one. So it's very, very prolific. It can eat a lot of different things. And so the point is, flowers are going to attract them. And they may really need, depending on their physiological condition, they may really need that pollen or nectar. So they'll come for the flowers, and if they find aphids, then they'll lay on the aphids. They can smell the aphids, so they can find the aphids quite well on their own. But yeah, so devoting a certain area of your garden to perennial flowers will be really beneficial for the average person. And if you're growing in a greenhouse, it's the same thing. We've looked at high tunnel situations, and you do better in a high tunnel situation by putting lures which smell like plants, the green leaf volatile odors and things, you can buy them, and then actually having some flowers there flowering, and they will attract more natural enemies that will do you more good than actually releasing natural enemies and trying to contain them in there. Because they'll find a way out, and if they're not where they want to be, they'll just find a way out. And whereas if you produce the environment that's attractive, they'll come all by themselves. And I mentioned perennials in outdoor settings because perennials, in outdoor settings, you're probably going to be worried about weeds, and certainly where we are here. But the thing about all the weeds, they're annuals. They can't compete with perennials. So if you can establish a good perennial garden, not only will these, with a mix of species that flowers all summer long, so some will flower early, some will flower mid, some will flower late. And the weeds will never have a chance to establish because the perennials are coming up ahead of them and they have the stored reserves in their roots. And so they outcompete the weeds, and then they give you a longer period of floral resources. And so a longer period of attractiveness for all those beneficial insects. And again, the same thing are going to benefit pollinators. If you have a crop that needs pollinators, so you're doing a double good thing when you do that. You're not just benefiting the beneficials that eat your pests, you're benefiting pollinators.
One thing we haven't talked about is pesticides. You mentioned that the ones, I think you said it was Georgia, were highly resistant to pesticides. But in general, what sorts of effects do traditional or even organic applications of pesticides have on ladybird populations?
Well, that's a deep topic, but the older materials that were not very selective, the contact insecticides we were using up until the end of the 20th century mostly, are all neurotoxins. And so, yes, there's certain populations of lady beetles that have had so many generations of exposure. What they really have is high titers of enzymes that can detoxify these things really fast. But in the last 20 years, there are a lot of really good, more selective insecticides that are, for example, just kill aphids, okay? And they don't, there's a lot of safer materials that won't harm the lady beetles at all. Now, they're a little more expensive, but they're really selective because they act on, they'll usually be systemic, get absorbed by the plant, and then the aphid tries to feed and suck the juices. It's in the juices of the plant, and then the aphid dies. But not all systemic materials are safe. For example, the most popular one is probably the worst. The imidacloprid and the thiamethoxam, that group, they are actually very, very toxic to all natural enemies. And so their widespread use of seed treatment is another, as a seed treatment, is another source of concern because, again, that's basically a scorched earth policy. You want no insects on your crop, fine. You'll have no natural enemies when the seed treatment wears off.
Yeah, plus these systemic pesticides just should not be used on edible crops. They're not legal, but for people that aren't growing legally, there's a lot of concerns for the safety and efficacy of them in terms of consumers consuming or combusting a final cannabis product.
Yes. And, I'm not sure about the regulations and all of that, but I can guarantee you there's a lot of stuff you could use to kill aphids that's going to work really well, but you don't want that in your bud.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I know in Canada, that's part of their national program. All that stuff has to be tested for residues, just like food. Because there is that temptation for people to use things they shouldn't use. I mean, if you can use systemic insecticides, aphids aren't hard to control. But the problem is many of those are some amongst the most toxic of all insecticides. You can go all the way back to aldicarb, which is banned now, I think, in most applications because it's just so toxic to everything. You see, to be systemic in a plant, you usually have a water-soluble molecule that's more linear, so it can travel through the plant's vascular system. That means it's going to travel into you pretty easily, too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so, there's a lot of stuff that you shared today that I had no idea about lady beetles, even more so than your keynote speech. That's really fascinating. Do you have anything else that you just would like to share regarding these lady beetles? It's sort of maybe some interesting facts or other information before we sign off?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the idea of augmenting lady beetles in a greenhouse setting. But if we could get some that were mass reared safely in insectary conditions, and one of the candidates might be Harmonia xeridus, which is the Asian multicolored lady beetle. It's a tremendously voracious predator of aphids in so many different cropping systems, and I know it's present in hop orchards and places like that, so it'd probably be fine in cannabis. It doesn't, if it has good aphids, it'll go on almost any plant. But these things would not be hard to rear in the laboratory in large numbers. But the problem is, I don't know anybody that does it because they can't compete with the ones that are being wild collected that no one should be using. But if you could rear them, there'd be nothing wrong with augmenting lady beetles in a greenhouse if you had a sustainable system. And that's another thing. We don't know how sustainable all that harvesting of lady beetles will be over in California. Eventually, they may start depressing those populations. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with the concept of augmenting lady beetles if you could have some that were mass reared and you knew they didn't have any parasites, and you knew they were young beetles, how old they were, that they were going to start reproducing in a couple of days and lay lots of eggs all over your plant. All that would be great, but I don't see that we have that system in place. So if you have an open system where you can devote a little space to some floral resources, planting some floral resources, you're going to attract your own lady beetles, and you're going to attract a lot of other beneficial insects, not just lady beetles.
That sounds great. Well, I thank you so much for your time today and sharing this. I love hearing your passion for these insects. It's really, it's really awesome. Yeah. So thanks again for your time, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. You can call me anytime.
That was Dr. J.P. Michaud, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Don't forget to check out our website at www.kisorganics.com for more information and resources and links to topics we discussed on the show today. Please sign up for our newsletter on our website homepage so you can stay up to date while you're there, and give us a follow on Instagram at KISorganics. Thanks for listening.